So it's been a bit since I've done a wrap-up video, but I'd like to incorporate them more into the videos that I'm posting this year, and I think that bi-monthly is going to be my sweet spot. Hi, my name is Sarah Freshly, and welcome to Freshly Read Books. Also, just a quick plug for my channel that I usually wait until the end of the video to do, but we are so close to 2,000 subscribers and that would just be awesome. I can't believe it's this big already, but if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. We're about to have a lot of very fun Booker content as International Booker kicks off tomorrow, as far as like when this video is being uploaded, and also I have other videos planned during that time. So it's gonna be great. It's gonna be a journey. I'd love for you to come along with me. Ugh. Okay, self-promo makes me feel weird and awkward. So I wanted to talk about all of the books that I read in January and February, plus 2 bonus books. One of those is from December that I read, but was outside of my advent calendar video that I did for December, and it was the only one that was, so I felt weird doing like a wrap up just to talk about like one book I hadn't talked about yet. And then the other one is one that I read mostly in January and February, but I technically finished it in the first couple days of March. It's just because it's a big boy. You probably know what it is if you follow me on Instagram. Or actually, have I talked about it in a video yet? I don't even know. I feel like I have, just because I've been talking about it a lot, so like to have not talked about it in a video yet. Anyways, let's get into it. So I'm gonna go through these in order, and this first one is the book that was from, it was like the last book I read in 2021, but I just haven't talked about it yet, which is My Annihilation by Fuminori Nakamura, which was translated from Japanese by Sam Bett. Also, thank you to Soho Press for sending me this art copy. This book is out now. It came out January 11th, so you can pick it up if you'd like to, and I do recommend it. This book is a bit tough to explain, but basically there's like this diary that the protagonist is reading, and you're kind of learning the same information. Like, the protagonist knows very little more than you do as the reader. It's dark and sinister, and it kind of has this feeling of like closing in on you, especially at the beginning. And as you're reading, you get the sense that like something terrible has happened, but you just don't fully know what it is yet. And it's also got that sense of like, how deep does the rabbit hole go type of feeling, where like whenever you feel like you've kind of got a grasp for a little bit of what's going on, it totally like flips it on its head. So if you're into weird, dark, twisty, but not like thriller plot twist twisty, but more like, whoa, that's twisted, then this is the book for you. So now we're officially into January, which the first book that I read in January, the first book of 2022, was The Bone People by Keri Hulme. I have a full video talking about this one along with Kieran from KD Books, but we do go quite in depth. While there's not spoilers in that video as far as like what happens towards the end of the book, we obviously go a lot further into the story than I would in like this little wrap up here. So as just a kind of really quick rundown of what this is about, this follows Carolyn Holmes, who is kind of this reclusive woman that lives in this tower. This boy, Simon, shows up one day. There's a big storm, and so she's kind of got to keep him inside, even though she definitely doesn't want to have him hanging around. But slowly he does grow on her, as does his like foster father. Basically, this boy was like found by this guy Joe, and so they've got like a father-son relationship, even though it's not technically official, and the three of them are like the main characters. But also there's a lot of Maori mysticism. I didn't say this is set in New Zealand. There's a lot of Maori mysticism that's involved in it, a lot of weird and confusing portions where you're not like fully sure what's happening in like the physical world, let alone this like extra level. But overall, fantastic book. This won the Booker in 1985 and totally deserved it. I mean, I don't know what other books were on like the short list and the long list that year, but I think this one deserved it because I really loved it and I highly recommend it. Next, I read a short story collection called Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung and translated from Korean by Anton. These short stories were super weird, but like told in this deadpan way that I absolutely loved. It covered themes of motherhood, greed, patriarchy, capitalism, and I just like love a short story collection that can have this like cohesion through the stories. Like they do feel like they belong together without actually being about the same things, if that makes sense. And this short story collection definitely did that. Really good. So the next book I read was Heaven by Mieko Kawakami, translated from Japanese by Sam Bett. That's right, the same person that translated my Annihilation, the first book I talked about in this video. And that was by total coincidence, although he did comment on my Instagram post, and I am very proud of that. So Heaven follows two teenagers and is focused mainly on like them being in school, and they get bullied very heavily by their peers. And so they kind of find each other or talk to each other because of this, because they're like the only ones that can understand really what they're going through. And they discuss like these big philosophical questions that relate to what they're going through and what they're seeing in their lives, but it's done in a way that it doesn't feel weird that like the teenagers are talking about this. And I think that that's a great achievement for how that's done, because I think there are a lot of novels, particularly like YA novels, that have teenagers that are kind of like waxing about, you know, the universe or whatever, and you're like, what? You don't sound like a teenager, you barely sound like a person. But basically what I'm saying is they just did a great job, and I found it to be realistic, but also these very interesting conversations that I loved reading. If you couldn't tell yet, this was like a really good period of reading for me. Like January, February, I read so many books, with the exception of a couple that I ended up really loving. And one of those is this next one, which is Dante's Inferno. This is actually like the entire Divine Comedy here, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. But I only read Inferno, and I did end up DNFing it before I finished. I was really close to finishing, it just... So I decided to read this because there was a little read-along that Kieran from Katie Books was doing along with some others, and I have a hard time saying no when things like that are going on. Not like anybody asked me, just like I see it happening and I ask myself, and I had a hard time saying no. And also, you know, you hear about like the 9 circles of hell all the time, and that's still like referenced today in like popular media, and you kind of want to read the source material and like know for yourself. And I did, like, I didn't hate my time reading this. There were certain aspects of it that I really enjoyed. Like, Dante is a trip going through hell. Like, he seems so full of himself, and like the way he has the other characters like talk to him while he's getting this like literal tour of hell is hilarious. Also, I think that the translator of this edition, which is Steve Ellis, I think he did a great job. So I don't actually have anything like that negative to say about this book or this story, except that I wasn't feeling it. And I felt like it took a lot of concentration that I just didn't have to give it, or that when I did have that concentration, I wanted to give it to other books. So that was all that I read in January, or I mean, like Inferno, technically I started this in October when the actual read-along was happening, but I just was so slow that the whole thing was over by the time I decided to just DNF the first book. But that decision happened in January. So I didn't read a ton in January, but I think I made up for it in February, where I read 10 books, which for me is pretty good. So the first book I read in February was Sissy, A Coming of Gender Story by Jacob Tobia. So this was a memoir about the life of Jacob Tobia and their kind of process of discovering that they didn't really fit into these like traditional gender norms and continuing to learn like more and more about themselves. They do a great job of talking about the different events that happened in their life and the way that this kind of shaped the future of their life. And I think they did a great job of incorporating humor, and it was really nice to see someone get so involved in activism. And I think that there's kind of this idea, and maybe there's not for other people, but for me, this idea that you can't really like help a cause, specifically like a human-centric cause, until you fully understand it, or you're not like struggling with the concept of it anymore. Like, that's when you can be an activist for that thing. But even Jacob Tobia was still learning more and more about themselves while getting so far into activism and working for this better future. And really that the main point is that you're always kind of figuring yourself out. You're never like fully there. So there shouldn't be this expectation of you need to be, you know, the perfect version of this before you can do this in anything whatsoever, activism included. Then we've got Sharks in the Time of Saviors by Kawai Strong Washburn, which is a Hawaiian family saga that follows, so there's 2 parents and their 3 children, the youngest of whom, Nainoa, or Noah for short, he, at one point, they're like on a boat and he falls overboard and is saved by sharks. And from then on, he has this kind of healing ability. And so there is this like bit of magical realism that's mixed into the book, although it's more about the spirituality, I guess, or these Hawaiian gods. But of course, more than that, it's really just about the family and the struggles that they go through. All three children end up moving off the island to mainland USA, and they all have very unique struggles. And I think they all kind of come from these expectations that have been placed on them or that they've like internally placed on themselves. And I think that that's a very interesting, like you can see in each of them so much the expectations that they have for themselves and that others have for them. And it's so prevalent and it impacts their decision making so much, whether they want to continue down the path of their expectations or whether they want to go the opposite way and like reject them. But you can kind of see it in every decision that they make, which is really cool. Also, this book has so many great quotes. I'd highly recommend reading it. So the next book is Bolla by Pajtim Stotovci, which was translated from Finnish by David Haxton. This book is set in the 90s to like early 2000s and follows Arsim, who is Albanian and has just recently gotten married, and he's working towards getting a degree at a university in Kosovo, although like this is a place that's very against Albanians, so he's dealing with that. And then he meets Milos, who is Serbian, also living in Kosovo, and shortly after meeting they kind of end up having this like love affair. And just before that like officially starts, I guess, is when Arsim finds out that his wife is pregnant, so he's kind of like living this double life, I guess you could say. And I actually ended up DNFing this book. I was trying to read a lot of recently translated works that could possibly show up on the International Booker long list, which is part of why I picked this one up, but also just because the premise, the synopsis sounded interesting to me. And while I think it is told in this interesting way, I was overall a little bit bored by it. I think Arsim as a main character in general, he's the one that you focus the most on. He's a very unlikable character, like he's not doing a good thing. And while I can try to like empathize with certain things that he's going through, there are still reactions that he has and things that he does that like I can't justify. So overall, I would say he's an unlikable character, which isn't in itself a bad thing. But I found that he also doesn't really have like anything interesting to say or like these new perspectives to bring. So overall, I was just kind of like not interested. So I kind of sat back and was like, okay, if this wasn't on the long list, like if the long list came out and I found out this wasn't on it, would I finish reading it? And the answer was no. So I decided that since I didn't know if it was on the long list or not, I should just set it aside, DNF it, return it to the library, and wait until I know if it is actually on the long list. And if it is, I will definitely finish it. And who knows, maybe the ending of the book will change my mind about it. Next up, we have The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, translated from Japanese by Steven Snyder. So this was my February TBR Tackle pick, so I have a full video that is about just this book if you'd like to go watch that. It's spoiler free, but obviously I talk more in depth about it than I'm about to right now. But this book is about an island of people that kind of like collectively lose the memory of certain objects, things, ideas, and the memory police are there to help ensure, I guess, that this happens. And I kind of struggle with saying the synopsis of this book because while yes, technically that is all what this is about, it's not really about that. Like, it's about loss, it's about grief, it's about memory. But I think the synopsis in general kind of has this come across like it's a dystopian sci-fi novel. And when you hear those words, your expectations, I think, are set in a different place. Whereas this is a beautifully subtle book that can be taken in many different ways, and I've had a lot of fun like reading more about other people's perception of this book and what they thought it was about, what it meant to them, because it seems to be different depending on the person, and it just does a really great job of creating this story that can be looked at and felt in many different ways. Then we've got The Green Mile by Stephen King. This is another book that I have a full video on because this was actually my January TBR Tackle book, which I did finish after my February one, but it was for a reason. I will say though that the video that I did that's on this one has full spoilers. I talk about my thoughts all the way through. Basically, this book was written in 6 installments, and then each installment was published 1 week apart. And so that was how I decided to read it, which is why I ended up finishing it after my February book. So I read it in installments, one each week, and updated in the video for each week. Now, unfortunately, I didn't really like this book. There were times when like there were installments when I like kind of saw myself liking it more, but overall as a whole, not a huge fan. I think that a large part of that comes with how the book was written. Stephen King has expressed interest in the past with rewriting it to be its own just singular novel, but that was something he said in '94 in like the introduction of this book, so I don't know if that's actually going to be a thing that happens. I also watched the movie for the first time in that video and talked about my thoughts of that. I do think that the movie was better than the book, if I'm being completely honest. But this story follows Paul, who is a prison guard in a prison where the inmates are on death row. And so he oversees them and then also their executions by electric chair. John Coffey is arguably the other main character of this book. He's a prisoner that comes into the system that has been convicted of having assaulted and murdered 2 young girls. And everything about John Coffey, like his demeanor, his personality, doesn't seem to point to him being a murderer or him having done these things that he's been convicted of. But I won't talk too much about what happens like later in the story. I just think that where it really fell short for me, one, it didn't feel like a book that was written with the end in mind, which might have just been the nature of how it was written. Also, there were many parts that were quite boring to me, especially the beginning sections of each of the installments, which also I think that's just a nature of how it was written. But the biggest thing for me was that John Coffey felt like, even though the whole story is really supposed to be about him, he felt like this like characterized version of a person instead of like an actual human being, and some of the things about him seemed very convenient for the other characters. Almost like he was more like a plot device, even though he's this very unique, I guess, person that could have had a good story, and I would have loved to have learned more about him. Instead, everything that he was given was very specific in order for things to happen for the other characters. And that was just kind of disappointing. The next 5 books I'm going to talk about, I'm going to do really briefly because my last video was a video covering all of these 5. So it's the Canada Reads contenders, the contenders for that award. That one is a spoiler-free video. So if you just want to know like more of my thoughts about these books in general, I would highly recommend checking that out. I'll really quickly go through the 5 here. The first one is Washington Black by Essie Adujan, which is about a boy named George Washington Black, also known as Wash, who grew up on a plantation until the plantation owner's brother ends up coming and like taking this special interest in him. He wants him to help him with this flying machine, ends up teaching him a lot of things, and Wash's life really changes from there on out. This book spans a large period of time and also a large period of space, many different countries, and is really kind of about Wash struggling with the things that he's gone through in his past, his perception of events that happened, of people that were important in his life, their motivations, and kind of this like shift that happens as he grows and has more life experiences, but a lot of times it's still with that lingering past and how he looks at that. Also, I didn't say, this is a wonderful book. You should definitely read it. It's really good. I had a great time with the Canada Reads books in general. Then we've got 5 Little Indians by Michelle Good. This one is about 5 people who all grew up in a residential school in Canada, the same school, but they kind of went their separate ways, a little bit together, a little bit apart. So it's about their time in residential school as well as their time after that and living their lives, the struggles that they have to face in a world that's not very accepting of them and who they are. And I guess how each of them deals with the trauma they experienced in very different ways. The next one is Life in the City of Dirty Water by Clayton Thomas Mueller. This book is a memoir of Clayton Thomas Mueller and his life growing up in Canada as an Aboriginal person, the different struggles that he went through. He ends up later in this more of this life towards activism for helping out other Aboriginal people, as well as environmentalism, climate change, working towards bettering that. And I do think he has a lot of very important things to say, especially around activism, but also around the culture that he grew to learn and understand more about, which was great. The only criticism I have is that it felt a little bit disjointed, and at some points it felt more like it was listing events that happened instead of letting us like really live in those moments and feel all the feelings that I think that they could have invoked had they been focused on a little bit more. Then we've got What Strange Paradise by Omar El-Akkad, which is about Amir, who is a Syrian boy that winds up on this refugee boat and then washes up on the shore of this island and meets Venna, who, even though they like don't speak the same language or anything, it's very hard for them to communicate. Venna is trying to help Amir get to safety and not be put through the refugee camp that exists on the island because it has very little resources, very little food for the people that they already have there. Not to mention, it doesn't have a great way of getting them citizenship. It's a process that takes an incredibly long time and seems impossible almost. Without spoiling anything, this is one of those books where the ending kind of makes you reflect back on the book in a new light. And then the last of my Canada Reads books was Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez, which was phenomenal. This book is set in Scarborough, which is a lower income neighborhood in Toronto, and it follows a few different families, more specifically like the children in those families. So there's like 3 of them, and they all go to this kind of morning program with a facilitator, Hina Hassani, who is arguably also one of the main characters of the book. But it does really dance around with whose perspective we're getting. Sometimes it's even just like a neighbor or somebody down the street that we're getting the perspective from instead of like a character that you're used to. So there's a lot of looking at other people through the eyes of someone else, and it's all about like that perception of each other. This is like a heart-wrenching book, but it has these amazingly happy moments and then equally these moments that are really sad. So overall, just fantastic book. And then last, we have what I spent most of my time in January and February reading, but didn't technically finish it in either of those months. I finished it in March. That's right, we've got The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, translated by Jennifer Croft from Polish. This is quite a big book. It's nearly 1,000 pages long, and it's dense. I learned so much reading this book that I didn't know about. I had to like literally sit there with Google ready to go to look up any Jewish words that I just did not know the meaning of, or words that were maybe specific to the time period, the locale that I didn't know what they meant. So this book is set in the mid-18th century and follows Jacob Frank, or Jacob Frank. After watching YouTube videos, I've heard it pronounced both ways, not quite sure, who is this like self-proclaimed messiah character. And so it follows him and then also his followers, and like from beginning to end. I really struggle with how I felt about this book because the first like half I was really enjoying it. I was learning so much that I didn't really expect to have as good a handle on as I ended up getting, which still not great, but like way better than I expected. I had like all this motivation to do a good job reading it. Like I said, having Google ready to go. If I would like run into a character that I didn't really know or remember who they were, I would typically do my best to like go back and try to remember, jog my memory as to who that person was before continuing on so that I didn't get lost. But then something kind of ends up happening, you know, like 800 pages later, where you don't really want to do that anymore. You just want to finish the book. You've been reading it for months now. So I think I kind of lost that motivation. Also, like everybody changes their name, which like not cool to do in a book that has this many characters. Like I understand why. This is a book that's about a real person that existed, even though it is a novel. Like, you know, some of these things actually happen. So, and I think that Tokarczuk did a good job of like reminding us who's who later on, but it was still like really confusing. So yeah, I think that it just kind of compounded on each other. And obviously like the further into the book you get, the more characters there are. It's not like just the beginning, you get introduced to everybody that's going to be in the book and like you're good. It's like every chapter there's at least one new person, if not like 20 new people. So by the end, there's so many people, and some people have the same names, so that's not helpful. Or just like very, very similar names. And so yeah, it got to be really difficult by the end of it. And so like obviously a lot of work went into this book, and I feel a little weird just saying, if it was a little shorter, maybe I would have liked it better. But I think that that's my honest opinion. That's my honest review. I think that I would have liked it more if it was a little bit shorter, or if it was like broken down into different books that were published at different times. Not just like, technically, it is broken down into different books. Like the Book of Fog, the Book of Metal and Sulfur, the Book of Sand. Ugh, the Book of Sand. Don't think about it, Sarah. Don't think about it. You're through that. You're past it. So yeah, I think had it been presented in a different way, we'll say, I could have enjoyed this a lot more. Because while I do think that this book did a lot for me, I also think I didn't enjoy it. Anyways, that's all of them. That's all of the books that I read in January, February, plus my 2 bonus books. So I thought maybe a good way to close this out would be like, what 3 books from this list would I recommend that you read? Which for me would be Scarborough, Heaven, and also The Bone People. But also, if I could add more than What Strange Paradise, and also The Memory Police, and also actually maybe Washington Black. Okay, I'll stop. But yeah, it was clearly a really good start to the year reading wise. So let me know what your favorite books were for January and February, and also what you thought of these books. And I will see you next Wednesday. Actually, probably before then, because Booker Longlist, International Booker Longlist will be announced tomorrow as of when this goes up. And so there'll probably be some video about that either on my channel or on Kieran's channel, or both. And also there's already a predictions video on his channel. So if you haven't checked that out, go check that one out. A lot of fun stuff coming down. So I'm really excited to kick off Booker season. I've missed it so much. I have so much fun doing it. I'm very excited to read more translated work. But yeah, anyways, see you soon, I guess, on either my channel or Kieran's channel. Bye.